Hello and good morning, everyone. It's very exciting. It's the first time I've been 5 feet, 5 inches tall, and it's really nice to be with everyone. It's wonderful to be here both in person and hello to our virtual audience as well at the 2022 Sovereign Nations of Virginia Conference. I would first like to recognize the chiefs of Virginia's tribal nations and council members. Thank you for your tireless leadership, and it's an honor to be standing in front of you today. Also, I would like to say thank you to Kitki Carell for providing such a comprehensive historical context on the relations between tribal nations and the U.S. government, which is crucial information when understanding what tribal land ownership means to sovereignty. I would like to build off of the lessons that Kitki just shared with us in this next session of today's conference, which is a panel on the intersections between Indigenous-led conservation, the climate change crisis, and sovereignty. Without further ado, I'd like to officially welcome you all to our panel session. My name is Zoe Yuki Guzner. I am a marine conservationist with the Pew Charitable Trusts, and I will be serving as the panel's facilitator today. As we all know, Indigenous-led conservation, sovereignty, and the climate change crisis are three incredibly dense topics on their own. And making them more complicated is the fact that they do not exist in isolation. Their impacts overlap and compound each other, and so addressing just one of these three dense topics by itself does not reflect reality because it ignores the highly interconnected nature of each of them. So, in today's panel, we are going to lean into that complex reality of these intersections. We will hear from three Indigenous experts, each with different professional backgrounds and lived experiences, about how their conservation-based work aligns with tribal nation sovereignty and cultural preservation goals. Since there will never be a one-size-fits-all solution to the challenges within each of these three dense topics, by providing you all with place-based perspectives and concrete examples of how these three fields both support and sometimes stand at odds of each other, our hope is that you'll find today's panel insightful and potentially inspiring as you navigate the intersections between Indigenous-led conservation, sovereignty, and the climate change crisis. Before we continue, there are two items I would like to note. First is that this session is 2 hours in length about. Following the session, we will break for lunch, so I promise I won't go over time. And the second note is a favor for our audience members. As soon as a question or a comment comes to your mind today from today's panel, please write it down. For our in-person audience, if you could use those 3x5 index cards on each table and write down your questions and thoughts, throughout the panel, I will prompt you to raise them high in your air and we will collect them from you so I can read them to our panelists during our Q&A section at the end of this session. And for our virtual audience, please submit your questions to the Zoom chat box, and I will do the same to collect them and ask our panelists those great questions. All right. To make sure everyone knows what to expect and what's coming next, here is the run of show for our session today. There are 4 sections in our session, and we've already begun our first one, the welcome. After that, we will hear from our 3 panelists. Following our panelists' presentations, I will facilitate a roundtable discussion with the panelists where we will dive deeper into some of the topics they are presenting on today. After the roundtable discussion, I will pose the questions submitted by the audience to the panelists. It is my great honor to introduce these 3 incredible panelists who are on stage with me today. We are so lucky to learn from Dr. Casey Thornbrew, could you wave? From the United South and Eastern Tribes, or USET, Chief Laura Ann Chason of the United Homa Nation, and Daniel Cordalis with the Ridges to Riffles Indigenous Conservation Group. And kicking off our presentations today, Dr. Thornbrew is kicking off our presentations today, that's who. He is a citizen of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and has a career as an Indigenous climate scientist, where he uses his expertise with USET to support tribal nations and their goals to adapt to and mitigate the impacts of climate change. Dr. Thornbrew, I'd like to pass the microphone and podium off to you to finish your introduction and begin your presentation. To note, we might need to hear the story behind your big smile and that great outdoor office that's in your photo on this slide.
Natash, thank you. And I want to acknowledge Ms. Zoe Guzner for working so hard to help us panelists to prepare to be here for our presentation. Kui kwasnamu, good morning. Natasawis Casey Thornbrew, Ganu Thomas Masipia. My name is Casey, and I'm Mashi Wampanoag. I'll talk about this picture very briefly to stay in time. Prior to working for USET, I worked for my own tribal nation, Mashi Wampanoag tribe, in the Natural Resources Department, specifically as the director for the Natural Resources Department. This picture, you're seeing me out in the field in our homelands and in my waders in the Santuit River. I'm smiling probably because I'm being teased as in my presentation, as I'll share, I actually grew up away from my community. I grew up in the Southwest, but returned home as an adult. So my cousins and relatives and coworkers are taking a desert person and putting them in the water. So that's kind of what's going on there. So without further ado, let me go ahead and jump into it. So I wanted to also, before proceeding, say Katapatanamu and thank you and acknowledge our relatives. As I said, I'm Mashi Wampanoag. I'm from up north. But I'm grateful to be here and to have been invited by Chief Ann Richardson. So I'm grateful to be here in the homelands, the Mid-Atlantic tribal nations, my southern relatives, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I currently work remotely and live in Mashpee in our homelands with my wife and our 8-month daughter. It was really important to me and our family to move back to our tribal nation and community, specifically, or one of the primary reasons for my daughter to, at least in the first few years of her life, have access to our culture, our language, and homelands. When she becomes an adult, I know she'll choose wherever she lives. But in the first years of her life, that's why I wanted to be there. So today I'll be talking about tribal land and climate challenges in the United South and Eastern Tribes region. Just want to introduce you all to my family and tribal nation. The top photo on the top left is my cousins, my wife, and our children. So 2 generations at the Mashi Wampanoag tribe annual powwow, which occurs every summer. So this was this past summer. The next picture is actually a photo from my childhood. This is my mother facilitating a training. My mother, Cheryl Green, about the time I was born, worked as the director for the Community Services Unit for the Boston Indian Council. Today it's known as the North American Indian Center of Boston. And after that time, we eventually ended up in the Southwest as my mother served as one of the founding board members for the National Indian Youth Leadership Project. The reason I wanted to mention this today is because my mother's very much been an inspiration to me to whatever work I do, whether it's in the science space or specifically the climate science space, that it benefits tribal nations, communities, and Native people. Other people that have been inspiring in my life are my grandfather, the late George Green, picture on the far top right, and my uncle, his son, my mother's brother, Mr. Chucky Green, who also served as the director of our tribe's natural resources and served as our tribe's TIPO before then. He is now retired and enjoying fishing, but he is still very much an important person in my life and someone that I learned traditional knowledge and history of our people. So our tribal nation, Mashi Wampanoag tribe, Mashpee, the original word is Masipi. Masipi means great waters, and it's referring to Mashpee Wakeby Pond, a very large freshwater place, which is important because we're a coastal people, but having this access to fresh water has enabled us to stay in that place for thousands of years. Wampanoag comes from the word Wapanaak. So Wapanaak means people of the first light or the dawn. So you kind of put those together, and today it's Mashpee Wampanoag. A little bit about our history, or just as concisely as I can put it. I want to acknowledge and kind of bounce off of the presentation from Director Keitke Carroll when he talked about the Allotment Act and the impact on tribal nations across the country. Mashpee today is a town, and the town's boundaries, or even beyond the town's boundaries, was the site of our original, what you might call a reservation, but it was actually before it was the United States, under the Crown. But this land that we come from, we've been there for thousands of years. Once the area became the United States and then the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the area of Mashpee, it was then called the district, was changed. Its status was changed between 1869 and 1870 from that of district to the town of Mashpee. What that did was kind of set the ball rolling for our lands to be taken from our jurisdiction through taxable lands, or families not being able to afford to stay in a place. And over the course of about 100 years, actual land that was under the jurisdiction of a tribal family or Mashpee Wampanoag tribe dramatically reduced. We have a saying in Mashpee, it all started here, because Mashpee in many ways is like a microcosm of the United States. When, as Director Carroll had presented, 97% of tribal lands being taken during the Allotment Act. It's about proportionally the same in Mashpee. It's more like 99% of what is 25 square miles being taken from us. Our tribe worked very hard to obtain federal recognition over 30 years, going through the process with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. There were many points along those 30 years, from the 1970s to 2007, where our tribe was approached to make a settlement in which we were being pressured to give up something to gain federal recognition. Those could be related to Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights. Those could be related to a number of other things. And our tribal leaders refused at that time, which has its benefits in terms of, today we hold on to those rights, but one of the challenges is in those 30 years, more land continued to be taken and developed. So there were also challenges related to that. The last picture here on the bottom right, deals with what has happened in the past few years. We had a fraction of our original homelands, 322 acres, so that's less than a square mile, placed into trust in early 2016. And this was a very big deal. This yielded a lot of benefits to our tribal nation, to get the housing program rolling, to start setting our own water quality standards in rivers that abutted our tribal nation and community. In 2020, in the last administration, the Department of the Interior attempted to disestablish our lands in trust. Thankfully, that has been turned around, and we continue to have these lands in trust and use that to administer our programs. But I share this because I think our tribal nation community knows firsthand how fragile our land tenure can be, at least on paper, through the political winds of the United States. So some background on myself and working in climate and natural resources. As I said, I grew up away from home and in the Southwest, but pretty much through middle school onward, I gained this major interest in geography and weather and climate. One of the best gifts bestowed onto me was from my sister, who gave me a weather journal. So every day I'd put in what was going on, and from the local news or radio, what the high temperature and low temperature was. And I'd keep that every day. I'd start to figure out what the average is for a given season, and all this, and can compare those. My father would actually play a game and say, okay, Boston, July, average high, average low. I'm like, average low 65, average high 82, record high 104. These numbers were in my brain. These numbers are changing. That was the average in the 1980s. So, we're seeing these changes. So I went on to college at the University of New Mexico and then the University of Arizona, so hence the picture of the saguaro and the thunderstorm in Arizona. One of the greatest privileges I had in my life was to teach weather and climate at a tribal college, at Donna Altum Community College, serving the Donna Altum Nation in southern Arizona. We're going to be talking a little bit about traditional ecological knowledge, but one of the challenges I face is in teaching a college level weather and climate class, the curriculum available is very standardized, kind of Western science focus. And I was very open and honest with my students, and I said, we are using terms that are from foreign languages, foreign to this place. So climate is actually Greek. It comes from the word klima. Weather comes from the Germanic language. So what we were challenged, we, me, myself, and other instructors, is to make the curriculum culturally responsive and relevant for all Altum students. And so I work closely with language and culture instructors, elders in the community, to say, how do we learn that first or help and do that? So for example, how will we describe the water cycle in Altum language? And then for myself as Wapana'ak, how might I describe ocean currents and tides in Wapana'ak first, and then add on to that, okay, the other Latin terms, the other Greek terms to describe those. It was a tremendous challenge because many of our tribal nations are in the space of trying to also reclaim and bring back our language to everyday speaking. Going back to these bottom pictures, that really gave me the itch to return home, especially since family members are like, come on. So I returned home to work in the Natural Resources Department of our tribe, and it's a complete change from 25 years living in the Southwest to the coast. River herring and the water is everything for us. When the herring come in from the ocean in April, mid and late April, that's our cultural new year. That's when spring's back. That's when things are starting to come back. Some of the work we did, and this picture showing me here, is coming in on weekends and building oyster trays. Oysters are traditional foods, and we're dealing with impaired waterways and estuaries, and so algae that's building up in the estuaries is dying and is creating mud at the bottom. So if you just put oysters in there, they sink into the mud and suffocate and die. So we had to build these trays to elevate the oysters above the bottom so they could survive. So these kind of on-the-ground work. So let me go into the work that I'm doing now and kind of segue into the climate change space. I've had the privilege and pleasure for working for United South and Eastern Tribes since 2017. And I kind of wear two hats. One is a tribal climate science liaison, and one is a program manager. As a tribal climate science liaison, I'm funded through the Bureau of Indian Affairs Tribal Climate Resilience Program to serve as a liaison and connect tribal nation agencies, departments, and staff to personnel, resources, and information at regional climate adaptation science centers. And that's what this map is demonstrating. Under the Department of the Interior, there are these regional climate adaptation science centers, or CASCs, as they're called, that look at climate change impacts on fish, wildlife, and ecosystems, and what are how to use the information, what's known about climate change and what's projected for climate change in the future to make plans to adapt to these changes. You see these arrows kind of going one way, but it's really a two-way street here because Many at the Climate Adaptation Science Centers have not had the experience of working with tribal nations and as tribal nation partners. So it's an educational activity as well, teaching researchers and scientists things like tribal sovereignty, nation-to-nation relationships. When I first came on, one of the things I was seeing was people discussing, like, let's work with tribal communities, let's do this. And I would say, well, yes, there are communities within tribal nations. Sometimes tribal nations that may have a smaller population, the community of the nation might be one and the same, but getting people to think of tribal nations as nations, like you're going to work with a country on an adaptation plan, and each nation has an agency. Like the United States has an EPA. Tribal nation, it may be called the Environmental Department. It might be called the Natural Resources Department, but it's an agency. In my role as a program manager is to provide technical support services directly between USET and tribal nations within the USET region. To do this, another example from Director Carroll's presentation is going through those grants and getting the grant funding to hold a workshop, to hold the training. So some of the things that our program now does are tribal adaptation plan and vulnerability assessment writing retreats. We have found that sometimes it might be a single tribal nation department or even a single staff that's tasked with writing the vulnerability assessment or the adaptation plan for their tribal nation. So these programs that we do are to kind of pull people away from their day-to-day work for just enough time for them to focus and get some headway on writing. We also do, and we've been able to commence, I should say, in-person tribal climate camps, inviting teams or delegations from tribal nations to spend a week at a place. And this last summer, it was up at the Wabanaki homelands of the Wabanaki nations up in the space of Maine, to focus on how is climate change impacting your tribal nation community. What are some of the challenges, maybe engaging the community or engaging tribal government or working cross-department? And so each team had a project and a deliverable. So they would work on it for a week and bring that back to their tribal nation and try to implement it to work to address climate change. So when we think about climate change, I know a lot of what may come to mind is some of the current impacts that we're seeing and some of the projections that may be happening. When I think about climate change, and these are conversations I've had with my uncle Chucky Green many, many times, our tribal nation and many tribal nations have experienced climate changes over thousands of years. Specific to our tribal nation and tribal nations in the Northeast, we've seen areas of glaciers, areas where glaciers receded, where sea level rise has come up. There was a time where the sea level was between 300 and 400 feet lower than it is today. So areas that were dry land where our ancestors are now underwater in many places. We know this because of our stories. Our stories tell of these changes. And so this bottom picture here is showing my Uncle Chuck as a culture instructor for our youth camp. First thing we let our students know is that they're scientists already. If science means a systematic way of understanding the world, tribal nations and indigenous peoples already do that, and we've been doing that for thousands of years. So we're already scientists. But how we understand our science and how we practice our science is really influenced by the culture. So our stories, we had front row seats to dramatic landscape changes. And that's our traditional knowledge. So I never want to park there because, as many of you may know, there's a narrative that, oh, the climate's always changing, so there isn't a problem. There is a climate crisis now because the changes that are happening so fast, and they are impacted by human ways of life and kind of industrialized societies. So we're seeing glaciers recede within a generation. We're seeing ecosystems actually move. The bottom picture, you're seeing sea level rise in Mashpee. That's a tree stump actually in Wakawite Bay. And in the east, the news may focus a lot on wildfires out west, but wildfires are a concern too in the east, and we have to pay attention to that. We are seeing more frequent and costly extreme weather events. My tribal nation, and I know many tribal nations, we now have emergency management departments. We may call them Homeland Security agencies as well. Ours is dealing with severe weather all the time, and one of the examples I bring up is tornadoes. Cape Cod and Massachusetts, it's not that tornadoes never happen, it's that they're rare. They might happen every decade or every couple decades. The past few years on Cape Cod, we've had a tornado touch down every year. And that's a scary thing if you're not used, I mean, for anyone. But on Cape Cod at 1 in the morning to have my phone go off and say, you need to get in your basement is pretty scary. Sea level rise, we are seeing that over the past 100 years, the sea level has risen about 8 to 9 inches along the Atlantic coast, but in some places that's compounded with subsidence. So mathematically, some places are actually seeing 2 to 3 feet of sea level rise. And places that are really level, that means that water is going inland really far. This impacts our coastal nations, and we are having to make plans and often, in many cases, very difficult decisions on what to do about this. Our traditional foods are moving, especially those of us that rely on coastal foods. So as I said, I live on Cape Cod, and there are not many cod left in Cape Cod. Cod is a cold water fish, and in addition to have been overfished, its range has moved north. So we're starting to see more warm water fish species in our area. So how do we adapt and what's going on? In our USET program, in our climate resilience program, we have an amazing staff that help me to do these workshops and trainings. You're seeing a picture of our climate summit that we did, hosted by the Oneida Indian Nation in 2019. A picture of our forest adaptation technical assistant, Mr. Tyler Everett, who works with his tribal nation and many other tribal nations to inventory what culturally important species you have, and in their case, he works on brown ash trees, to take an inventory, take stock of what's important and then how to protect it. This next photo is Dr. Kelsey Leonard from the Shinnecock Indian Nation, and these links are in here, and I encourage everyone to read her paper on the wampum adaptation framework. Those of us from tribal nations on the East Coast and many tribal nations in the East may familiar and have wampum in some way or fashion in our cultures. But wampum is an acronym here to witness the changes and the warnings that are happening from climate change, to acknowledge your traditional knowledge and to use it to adapt, to mend Mother Earth, to whether there are changes and how you restore that, to protect cultural sites, to unite tribal nations, to work together to adapt to climate change. And the last M is the really difficult decision if it comes to that point. If sea level rise means you need to move your nation and community, to do it using your sovereignty and your decision making. So these two pictures on the bottom are two examples, one from the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead Aquina, restoring sand dunes, replanting beach grass as a natural buffer to sea level rise and storm impacts. Another picture from the Alabama Coshada tribe and prescribed burning to protect and maintain and grow the longleaf pine ecosystem, culturally important tree species, not only for their tribal nation, but many tribal nations in the Southeast. This will be my last slide, and I'll conclude. So land-back conservation for adaptation sovereignty, what I'm seeing here is where tribal nations are reacquiring lands, whether it be Pine Island with the Passamaquoddy tribe, or lands that now are back in the hands of the Rappahannock tribe, or I must mention, as Mashpee Wampanoag, the Native Land Conservancy, also working to reacquire lands. When you have that land under your jurisdiction, the adaptation decisions that you make, the climate change planning decisions, are your decisions to implement. And your sovereignty can be used to go through that. Many tribal nations, especially in the East, we have to work really hard with other states, municipalities, federal agencies on lands that are culturally important to us, but we may not have direct jurisdiction on it unless we're trying to get that back. But once we do get it back, granted internally we have to kind of decide what we're going to do, but we have that sovereignty as a tribal nation on what to do about climate change in that space. Katapatanamu, thank you all, and again, pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Thornbrew, for your great presentation and sharing with us how you and USET's work supports tribal nations' agency and sovereignty to mitigate the impacts of climate change. I've really enjoyed our conversations preparing for this panel, so thank you. Our second panelist for today is Chief Laura Ann Chason, who is the principal chief of the United Homa Nation, where she has dedicated over 40 years of her life and work to. In addition to her impressive list of accomplishments, contributions, and roles to Indian country, which is listed in the program, she is a basket weaver, as evidenced by this great photo here, and is incredibly passionate about Indigenous food knowledge. Chief Laura Ann Chason, I'd like to pass the microphone and podium off to you to finish your introduction and begin your presentation.
Well, bon matin, and good morning, everyone. Like she was saying, I'm a newly elected chief of the United Homa Nation. But first, I'd like to thank the indigenous people here in Virginia for allowing me to come onto their homelands, and I appreciate that. Also, I'd like to thank Chief Ann Richardson. I've known Chief Ann for approximately 28 years. We've worked together. So, and she's an inspiration for me and all other women in this country that's in leadership. I've always admired Chief Ann. We still work together with the Department of Labor. We both was appointed by the Secretary of Labor to be able to continue working in Indian country on the Department of Labor part. And then I also like to thank Ms. Zoe and Ms. Pat and Mr. Jerry for getting me here and helping me prepare this event. But I also like to thank my family, my partner Terry Adams. I like to also thank the United Homa Nation Tribal Council, the staff, and our people for letting me be here today. It took a lot for me to get here, to get away from home. So I appreciate them. I come from the largest tribe in Louisiana. And so let's see, let me get my pointer going. Our tribe has over 19,000 citizens. So it's a big undertaking for my new elected position. Okay. So the back of this right here, I don't know if you could see it very well, but the palmetto leaves, that's what we use for one of our baskets there. So I'll start off with our creation story. Our people believe that we're come from the crawfish. We built the land with the crawfish, and you can see the crawfish. Oh, okay, there it is. Sorry, I'm gonna get. So we believe that this is our creation story, and actually, it's funny because when I went to the Chickasaw Nation museum, their creation story is exactly the same as ours, and our tribal emblem is the crawfish. So, we all connected, and so our people are mound builders. The Homa people, and when you was talking about showing that map with LSU. Our tribe originated from the LSU, in the middle, the state. That's where our tribe originated, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But these are present-day mounds. And, you know, our mounds had a purpose. They were traditional community ceremonial burials. They were also the chiefs, and they also had waste mounds. When we just did a study, and one of our mounds was actually a waste. And so I thought that was very unique, and they were brilliant. Our tribal traditional knowledge led to engineers of the mounds to preserve thousands of years. Okay, so the migration here, when I was talking about the Baton Rouge area, my tribe was located in the most fertile grounds of all Louisiana territory at first contact. We lived in harmony with the water and had respect for it. And we had multiple villages and moved seasonally to coincide with the river stages such as spring floods. Even when pushed south, we moved to the areas where we could continue our relationship with the waterways. The Baton Rouge, where I was saying, was a boundary. Baton Rouge is actually means red stick in French. When the French explorers came and they seen a red stick, well, that was a boundary line between our tribe and the Bayagula tribes. And so a lot of people don't know the history. They know Baton Rouge means red stick, but they don't know the history. And our tribe has a stamp of all over Louisiana. Since we're an indigenous tribe of Louisiana, you could go to New Orleans at the Congo Square, and you'll see where our traditional green corn ceremonies was once held. And so, you know, in Louisiana, we have all the museums. We have our tribal baskets throughout Louisiana. And so I'm very proud of that. And especially since I'm not from a federally recognized tribe, our people are still here, and we're still surviving. And it shows throughout Louisiana. So I'll show you, this is where our tribe originated, and this is where we're at today. We live all along 6 parishes along the coast. And I was gonna point, but I live in the boundary line between Terrebonne and Lafourche, the purple and green, where it goes all the way to the end, that little bitty point. That's where I live at. So in 1927, the Army Corps of Engineers sought to tame the Mississippi River after the higher than normal rains and flooding from Illinois to the mouth of the building levees to prevent it from moving, shifting, dam the river at the Donaldsonville, Louisiana, preventing the fresh silk to replenish the marsh. And I say this because the Corps of Engineers, you know, man always think they're better than our Creator. So they damned this, and they're the original reasoning why we're in the shape, our Louisiana coast is in the shape we're in right now. And so about 40% of the state, the United States, actually dump right here in the Mississippi, in our backyard, which filters throughout our drinking water. Let's see. Oh, I sort of just read. Okay. Before the river was tamed, it moved freely like a water hose over time, feeding fresh water and silk into the Barataria estuary. Its silk deposits are now directed away from the area, leading to land loss. Before the rivers was tamed, it moved, sorry, I'm looking at the other notes. While all the land loss is happening around the tribe, the state of Louisiana has a $50 billion coastal master plan that is largely underfunded and excludes many tribal communities in the planning that are viewed as being cost prohibited due to cost benefit ratio. And I'll give you an example. The Morganza to the Gulf project started 2 miles from our tribal community and left the community out, which that community has now been relocated because they didn't want to spend the money to be able to protect us. So when the governor came down to be all excited, you know, this is the Morganza to the Gulf project, it's a major federal project, we protest. Because how disrespectful disrespected our tribal people to come into our area and start this levee, this massive levee, and leave our tribal community out. So all of our tribal community, and I'll speak for the Terrebonne Parish area, we have 6 tribal communities, and because we fought and went to these meetings, we were able to get 4 out of the 6 in the Marganza to the Gulf project. So culture is said to have a significant validation to the project. However, that has never been factored into the formula used to select projects for the funding. So right here, I like to, where you see these, it's called the bird claw. I don't have a pointer. Yeah. So anyway, so you see the circles. That's where land's actually being built because of the Chafalaya River and the Mississippi River. So the Mississippi River right now has to dredge the silk all the time because for the ships to get in and out. So it's job security, I call it. But it's building land, and you see where all the red is? That was all land, but now that's all water. Everything that you see in the red is all water. And also the invasive species now. The neutral was brought in for fur trade and quickly took over and feed on our native plants and hold wetland soil together. So with this right here, they try to, Louisiana, we always try to think that we could cook anything. We create a meal on something. Well, they had a few chefs that tried to market that. Well, that didn't work. Then they tried to try to sell the fur. Well, that didn't work. So now they're just eating up the marsh. And something that's new now is the apple snail. It was originally from South America, and it was introduced by the aquarium trade. Well, they attacked the stability of banks, led to erosion. It's something that it's all over now, and it's just taken over. And right now, it's like $74 million worth of damage each year. It's with the rice field, the corn field, and et cetera. Then they have the wild hogs. So the wild hogs are taking over, and I don't think that's just here in Louisiana. I think that's just throughout right now. But what happens is the wild hogs are really destroying our levees. So all this money they spending for levees, we have wild hogs that are just destroying it. Then we have the new, we call them China balls. Well, we used to take that for slingshots, and play marbles with that, which I didn't know that was an invasive species at the time growing up. And so now it's a real enemy for our people, for the native plants and trees. So the oil and gas, this photo 1. This right here is where I took a flyover to my community, and where you see these straight lines are, that's actually oil and gas navigation canals that was dug. And everything around there, that was all land. Well, the whole thing was all land, wooded areas, until the discovery of oil in the 30s. And then with that came the fresh water is no longer, the Mississippi River is dammed up, so we cannot get any fresh water any longer. The oil and gas, the discovery of oil and gas in the 30s. So what happens is there's no fresh water to replenish. So we're at the Gulf, and so that salt water just eats up the land. And where I live at, I own 10 acres of land. 21 years ago, we were hunting deer. Now I'm fishing in my backyard in 21 years. I'll have some pictures. And right here, this is around where my grandfather lived, my great-grandfather. And that was all wood. That was a community. And that's all dead oak trees. And here is a spill, an oil spill. Unfortunately, you hear a lot about the BP oil spill. Well, the BP oil spill is not the only spill that we get. We have several oil spills in our area. You just don't hear about it because it's not as big as the BP. And we have the highest cancer rate in Louisiana, what's called Cancer Alley. And I'll show you some pictures of that in a minute. But our people were the first ones to respond for this cleanup, for the oil spill. And we're paying for it today because of the cancer rate and the deaths that has happened. But it's our people that wanted to protect our land, so they actually, they're the first one on site. We need to take care of our people, our land. And so the next slide will show you right here, right now, all the red dots you see, that's platforms. That's oil rigs right now in Louisiana, on the coast. And all the yellow is the deep water, like the Deepwater Horizon BP. That's what these are right now in Louisiana. The oil and gas is king of Louisiana. Even with the many challenges from land loss, Louisiana continues to advocate and approve more and more requests for oil and gas drilling in its fragile environment. A large percentage of our tribal citizens work in the oil and gas industry, making the advocacy work challenging. As we need to ensure that the workforce investment these industries are appropriated, transitioning to comparable work opportunities. And the reason why a lot of our people are in the oil and gas is because of education. Our people weren't allowed to, my mother and father, we had a 3-tier a school system in Terrebonne Parish. And so my dad had a 3rd grade education in missionary, and my mother was able to go to the 8th grade education. I'm 57 years old, and the years prior to that, people went to missionary school, and I'm the first one to go to public school in our area. And so education, when they found out our people can navigate the waters very well, they started hiring our people. And to this day, we have so many of our tribal people that navigates those canals, running those tugboats, ships, and whatever, in that oil and gas industry. We have been approached by the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations that are interested in working directly with our tribe. They recognize our connection to land and water, our valuable resource. We look forward to these collaborations with scientists that value indigenous knowledge. This right here, all those red lines are pipelines that's running through Louisiana. And so I showed y'all where we live at. We live all in that area, and that's the pipelines that's right now in Louisiana. So this right here, this picture right here is in my area. It was a area view after Hurricane Ida. And everything you see behind that, you see the trees, all the dead trees in the water behind that, that was all woods. That was all communities. But there's no buffer any longer. There's no barrier islands any longer. So our tribal community is the buffer. I've been through 10 hurricanes, and I've never seen nothing like this last one. Where I live at, only 20% of the homes are still left. I'm still not back in my home yet. This right here is my home. This is the flooding after Ida. This is probably 3 days later. This is a shed. And you can see on the side, that's my house. It's raised. It's 11 feet in the air because of the flooding in my area, and don't want to go nowhere because it's our tribal community. And it's hard to leave. But so many of our people are leaving because can't afford the insurance any longer because after the Hurricane Ida, our insurance within the next 3 years is going to be going up 65%. Well, I pay $5,000 right now insurance. Can I afford that? I have to think about that. It's real. And so climate change is also strengthening the intents of these hurricanes. This hurricane was, we always, my partner said it was like Katrina on steroids because it lasted so long. This right here, this picture right here, this was land. This was actually a home in that area. And then the grandfather passed it on to the grandson as a camp, a weekend camp. Well, all that was land at one time, and this is the results of after Ida. This picture right here is my land. This is all of my family's land, and this is the result of Hurricane Ida. Well, the land here, the homes here, couldn't afford the insurance because I live 7 miles north of this. The insurance is like $13,000 below this particular area. Who could afford $13,000 for insurance? But that's reality of where we live at today. This right here is one of the tribal community where my dad's at. This is where my dad's from. All this is a before and after picture of Ida, after Hurricane Ida. And the top picture, which you can see the water, that was actually a tribal community. That was actually woods in that area. This is at the end of the road where I live at, which is about 4 miles from my house. And you can see the straight line of the navigation canal. But prior beyond that was woods. That was hard land. Actually, the electric lines are still there today because I shrimp. I do shrimping on the side. That's my love, is shrimping. And so all that is just gone, and it's unbelievable. But that is a reality. Our fishing, this is our fishing and hunting and harvesting, and increasingly difficult with all the threats facing these practices. Salt water and a repetitive flooding has discouraged traditional farming crops and impacting fishing, making earning living and supporting family and trade practice difficult. I could let you know right now, 30 years, because I grew up shrimping, grew up on a shrimp boat. What the shrimpers are making today is making less than they did 35 years ago. But you paying a lot more for that shrimp. But that's how they treat our shrimpers. The loss of language, losing the land means losing our connection to each other. We have a saying where I live at. When we pass in front of people's home, getting down, most people don't know what that means. Getting down, I mean, that could be a whole array of different. But what that means is, are you coming to visit? You coming to talk? You coming to eat? You getting coffee? Maybe drink a beer? That's what getting down is. And that's how our traditional stories, because to this day, we still get together. There's 2 guys that we always stop and visit. It's a little place on the island road, and they call it the social club. And so we always sit there and listen to the stories from these elders and love it. But our tribes is literally being forced to leave their land these days. No due fault of our own. The lack of federal acknowledgement. Growing up, I didn't know you had to become federally recognized. I knew I couldn't go to certain stores, couldn't go to certain pools, couldn't go certain places because I was in it. And they had a sign that says, "No Indians allowed." And so growing up, we didn't know that. We knew who we were, though. We knew we were Homa. But we didn't know we need federal recognition until later on in life, until the 60s, the 70s, when our tribal people started getting things together. In our culture, is very important. And even though we're not a federally recognized tribe, we still have a lot of our traditions intact. some of the language intact, our artwork is intact. And so, yes, federal recognition is very important for resources and so many different things. But it doesn't make me less than any one of you guys, because I am who I am, and I'm very proud of who I am. I'm proud to be Houma. And, you know, federal recognition would make it so much better, especially for our elders that has fought and tried to get federal recognition for our people. We've been in the process for over 40 years right now. But we're not going to stop. We have to continue. The language is very important, that we restore our language. We have a program that we actually working on, the language project. We have a language project. And also the burial grounds and other sacred sites. Mr. Earl was in our area. Earl was in our tribal community just recently, and unfortunately I wasn't able to meet him. But just recently, our parish started digging the foot of a mound, an Indian mound in our area, and in that area, because we're not federally recognized, we contacted the nearest federal tribe, because you're going to have more power than we do with this particular issue. But they actually started digging the base of a burial ground. That was the first week on the job. My inauguration was Saturday, this was Monday, dealing with this. And so the lack of respect in Louisiana, there's no penalties for digging a burial ground. So, but we actually worked together, and now they had to hire an archaeologist to do every step of the way, because it was a drainage project. And our land rights, no protection. We have no land rights. The fishing rights, we don't have fishing rights like everyone else. You know, and keeping our community whole, it's important. And because of the land loss and the environment that we're in, our people are just separating right now, moving to higher ground. So there's no community like it used to be. So I see a huge difference in our area, and it's because of that. And the natural disasters, I could tell you firsthand, after Hurricane Ida, it was probably almost 3 weeks. We didn't get electricity or running water. We didn't get electricity till Ida hit August 29th. We didn't get electricity until Halloween Day, and then we didn't get running water until the middle of November. That would never happen in any other place, but it's tribal community. I've seen it happen over and over again. But we have the Red Cross showed up approximately 3 weeks later. And we have a group in Louisiana, which it's called the Cajun Navy. But actually, there are people from all over the United States that's part of this Cajun Navy, because they're out there, and those folks are the first ones that we encounter to come help us. And the man-made disasters, the environmental protection restoration, and the climate change impact, and education. These are the things that we face every day as a non-federally recognized tribe and without any resources. We do our best. We do fundraising, and we do our best. And we try to do our elders. I guess the elders are the most important people in my life, because they are my keeper. They teach me, and I respect them. So federal recognition is important for me, for them, and the new people that's not born yet. What the future holds. The tribe works on internal research to determine a climate change plan that will offer citizens tools to make decisions on this term. Engage in collaboration to tell our story and help advocate for the sovereignty rights of the United Houma Nation. Ensure that Houma Nation people are given a voice. This picture here is right by my house. Everything you see was actually once land. The earth does not belong to man. Man belongs to the earth. All things are connected like the blood that unites us all. Man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does it to himself. Chief Seattle. Thank y'all guys for listening to me. I appreciate y'all.
Thank you so much, Chief Lore and Chason. It's speaking with you and Lenore as preparing for this panel is very enlightening, as you described, as she called, or Lenore called, the perfect storm to where you are today and what you've learned and where you go to the future. So thank you for sharing. And for our third and final panelist today, I would like to introduce, there you go, Daniel Cordalis. Daniel is a member of the Navajo Nation and is a natural resources and Indian law attorney. From this expertise, he serves as a co-principal to the Ridges to Riffles Indigenous Conservation Group. He is married to a Yurok woman and has 3 wonderful young boys. Daniel, we might also have to hear a little bit about this photo on your slide as you finish your introduction and begin your presentation.
Good morning. It's still morning. So I know I'm the last thing before you and everything that's out there. It's light, drinks, places to relieve yourself of drinks, things, all that. So appreciate you hanging in there. I know it's a long session. Thanks for putting this conference on. I think it's really cool to be here. And thanks to the Rappahannock Tribe for hosting this, not just this year, but before, and the organizers, of course. And it's really neat for me to be in USET territory and kind of to see USET kind of at work. I worked for the National Congress of American Indians about 15 years ago, and of course through that work got exposure to USET, but all my work was out west, and so it was really neat to be here and see the force and just kind of the incredible organization and everything that you guys do in this region. So thank you. It's also cool to be here with Casey. About 20 years ago, and I'm rounding there, Casey and I, before I even thought about going to law school, we were graduate school advisors for American Indian Science and Engineering Society. And yeah, and in different places, and I don't know where it was, Anchorage, somewhere in Colorado where I was, and Arizona where he was. We just met up, and just cool to be on the stage with him again. So here we are. So I'm here in the capacity as a principal for, the co-principal, with my wife, to the Ridges to Riffles Indigenous Conservation Group. We are a new nonprofit, native-led indigenous conservation organization, and we're hoping to use law and policy, which we use throughout our career to help tribal nations engage in the kind of work we're talking about here today, right? And a lot of this comes from our past experiences, whether or not it was working for the tribes that we've worked for, whether it's not for the nonprofits and the legal organizations that we've worked for, or the federal and state governments. We just see that tribes, this is a tricky area engaging in natural resource conservation and protection, and it's also really hard on tribal governments to fund these things, right? I mean, what I'm going to talk about here is on our work at the Yurok reservation, where my wife and my kids are all members of. But it was just hard just hard to get that funding year to year, even just to support our attorney work. But it was to make the projects move along, you kind of need to have that, but it doesn't generate a lot of money, so it's just hard for tribes. But we also noticed that there's a lot of money out there to support this kind of work, right? At the time, not non-federal. Now we have some federal money coming in, but I had worked for Earth Justice, the national environmental law firm that handles environmental issues throughout the country, and they provide all their work pro bono, right? So all the major conservation organizations get basically free incredible legal services to handle all the major legal work. And we don't really have that in Indian country. You know, we have the Native American Rights Fund, which does an incredible job, but they try to do it, they're responsible for so much. And so we thought, well, maybe we could try to help something here. And conservation and restoration work is kind of our calling at this point. So that's just to say where I'm from. We're currently living in Arlington, Virginia. Since the beginning of this administration up until fairly recently, I was the deputy solicitor for water resources in the Interior Department, and left to kind of reinvigorate this work for that we believe is really important, and getting back to work with tribes is so special. So today we're going to talk about reclaiming the Yurok forest. And this goes back to my time working with working with the Yurok tribe. My wife was general counsel there for 5 years, and I was able to work on basically our natural resources and water work, including some of the litigation. But some of the most important and really cool things that we did were reclaiming the tribe's lands and getting the tribe's fingerprints back into the management of that land. And through the course of what we've done, I mean, I've really kind of resolved around this word of reclamation. Reclaiming, reclamation, whatever it is. I mean, it's kind of funny because we spent so much water time on the Yurok River, the Klamath River, which had its, and you'll see it's got it's at the top of it, there's a reclamation project, federal reclamation project. And it's kind of flipping the words to kind of like mean something different than they intended, but it still works a lot for today and what we're trying to do. So as an overview, just to give you kind of the run of this show, this mini show within a show, I want to give you a little tour of the tribe. Describe basically like some of the legal and policy issues that created it and that kind of creates the frustrations that we're dealing with now, that uncertainty through the 1980s, and then get to kind of like where the tribe in the late 80s kind of turned the corner and said, here's the direction we need to go. How do we do that? And then some of the things on how the tribe, and we've worked on actually doing that. So one is just, we'll talk about some of these collaborative management, conservation initiatives actually that are going, and then dive a little bit into the forest. First thing, I guess we're continuing our path here from Cape Cod around to Louisiana, now all the way up to the west coast of California. I don't know which one to point at. I'll point at this one. But you see, we're at the very, very northwest, we being the Yurok tribe, are in the very, very northwest corner of California. When they say Northern California, they don't really mean Northern California. This is Northern California. And right, what you see here is let's see, this doesn't go that far. This is a map of the Klamath River Basin, and it's kind of shaped like a bow tie. And at the very most western edge, you see the town of Klamath. Traditionally, there are several Yurok villages there. Requa is the one that's at the edge of the river, at the mouth. Requa actually is how the tribe would pronounce it. And kind of the low stretch where the river kind of juts. I mean, of course, we're going upriver here, but we're headed south and east to kind of where it points down. That's the edge of the Yurok traditional territory. And then if you continued south on the tributary, that's where the Hoopa Valley Reservation is, in their traditional territory. And as you go upriver, you kind of you cruise up there and you end up in southern Oregon, in the headwaters, and you get to Crater Lake National Park, and it's kind of a high desert. The interesting thing about this basin, which is really interesting, is it's kind of inverted, where the top of the basin is basically this high desert area, kind of flat, very dry. And then as you move downriver, you get into basically wild and scenic America, right? I mean, the first few times I was out there, I was seeing bears pulling salmon out of the river. I was seeing, mountain lions running around, bald eagles, of course, everywhere. So this is very small. I'm sorry about that. But what you can kind of see in this map, there's no way to zoom here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the legal history of the tribe. So, of course, in Aboriginal times, the tribe's territory was effectively the lower 45, 46 miles of the Klamath River and, the watershed that it contains, right? Then that juts south a little bit. As you move south towards the towns of Arcata and Eureka, it encompasses the coast, certain lagoons and kind of high areas, basically up until those ridges. And then it extends a little bit north of the Klamath River, about 5 to 10 miles to kind of at the edge of that basin. So really you have this lower Klamath River watershed that the tribe had for its Aboriginal territory. And we're talking coastal redwood country, right? This is redwood country, tallest trees in the world, oldest trees in the world. Foggy, misty, it's 120 degrees, burning up in 30 minutes inland, and it's 65 degrees and chilly on the coast. But that fog and that mist is critical to maintain that ecosystem. And because it's mild, it's temperate, you have just incredible biodiversity, right? So all this green land you see to the east and the north is national forest and wilderness land, federal public lands, all that way. The big white square to the bottom, that's the Hoopa Valley Reservation. Over against the coast on the slice of green there, you get the Redwood National and State Parks. They're co-managed, these two right here. There we go, now it's working. All right, look at that. And here, all this yellow land is, sadly, it's land lost through different things, and now it's private land owned by, who would own all this land now? Timber. They've owned it since the late or early 1900s. Mr. Carroll had expressed and had discussed a little bit about the Dawes Act, 1887 Dawes Act, which basically authorized future legislation that allowed for the allotment of tribal lands. The Yurok Reservation was unfortunately, they were very much, I don't know what the right word is, but they were just decimated by that. So the 1855 executive order first creating the Yurok Reservation, created a reservation 1 mile either side of the Klamath River for 45 miles. Through the Allotment Act, the tribe afterwards only retained 5,000 of those acres. And they were all pretty much clustered right here, with a couple parts right up here, and maybe a couple random ones in there. But lost to allotment. 90% of the land, the tribal reservation, in the reservation was lost to allotment, mostly to timber companies. And throughout the 1900s, that land was hammered by timber. This southern side of the river, a lot of this is still big timber, and it's still hammered by timber. So, practically, this hurts in a lot of ways. I think one of the things that hurts the tribe a lot is just ecologically, what you do is you disconnect landscapes from each other, right? When you have these biological hotspots, biodiversity hotspots, what we don't have is the ability for species to move from here, where it's drier, down here to where it's more temperate, then move over to the coast when they need to, because you are in timber country and there's no habitat there. There's no safe place. There's no safe way from point A to point B. So this is one of the things we're looking at in this big overall strategy, not just the tribe, but of course, conservation and species advocates, and sometimes that includes federal agencies. But it's how do we connect landscapes, right? So when we talk about conservation, we talk about climate change, we talk about these big ideas, a lot of it is the ability for the systems to actually interact the way they are intended to, and that they had for thousands and thousands of years, and remove barriers that now we've created that don't let that happen, i.e. big extractive industries that create problems that way. But, of course, I think the best thing we can do is learn about, and the most beautiful thing that my experience has taught me working across different capacities, in Indian country, is that our most beautiful resource is our human resources, our people, right? So I just wanted to kind of pause and let you, get you a look at what it's like to be a part of the Yurok tribe. So this is a family. This is a traditional Yurok family, traditional in the sense that they're out there on the river fishing. And the reservation was created for one purpose, right? One purpose. If you put a reservation 1 mile either side of a river, it's to maintain that connection to that river. You can't. There's no way to not see that. And this is the most important thing for the tribes. So here you have a family fishing, pulling in Chinook. So like Casey was saying around the herring, right? The tribe. The river defines time for native people on waterways like this. So the salmon runs define what happens in the culture, what you do at any given moment, right? It defines when you have your ceremonies and when you go inside and take a break. This is the estuary towards the mouth of the Klamath River. This is obviously fishing season. So the tribe has a commercial, or I should say had a robust commercial fall Chinook salmon fishery. To the point where I think a lot of tribal members relied on the money they would make during this fishery to support themselves, right? We're very rural here in this part of California. The tribe is mostly grant funded, or has been, and there's just not many jobs because it's so spread out. It's hard to get from one side of the reservation to the other, a couple hours of drive, and there's nothing really in between but river. And so this fishery presents like a critical infusion of cash and ability for families to sustain themselves throughout the year. Once in the last 7 years has that commercial fishery been marginally successful. The rest has been closed a lot of the time. And at times, there's been such low salmon returns that they haven't allowed any tribal fishers on the river legally. Meaning that, in addition to a commercial season, you have a subsistence fishery for individual tribal members to catch and keep fish. There was a year that they didn't have enough fish to even allow that happen. Which means maybe since in the history of time, that was been the only time that Yurok people really have been unable to fish. And why is that? There's a lot of reasons, but that's just amazing and extremely sad. Upriver a little bit, and a place that we're going to talk about in a minute is some of the major tributaries. This is the Yurok Forest. This is the Blue Creek watershed. For you lawyers out there, you might know and heard of the infamous and terrible Ling decision, which is basically a tribal sacred sites case, went all the way to Supreme Court. Ultimately, the Supreme Court said, well, it's a federal government's land, they can do with it what they want, even though this would ultimately destroy the tribe's participation and ability to practice its religion and spiritual practices. That it's basically left up to the federal discretion there. Of course, I have my own terrible case coming from the Navajo Nation where the tribe, we tried a different angle on that, and they said, no, see, Ling already decided that the federal government can do what it wants to on its land. Even though this is such an incredibly important spiritual place, it doesn't exactly totally disallow you from practicing your religion. It just substantially impairs it, which we all know is not how spirituality works. So up through the 1800s or the 1900s, after this whole disestablishment, I don't want to say disestablishment, we know that's a terrible word to use, but that the Yurok Reservation was allotted so heavily, there was always these constant jurisdictional fights about who can do what on the river. The tribal people wanted to fish. The state said no. Tribal people kept fishing. The state said no. Tribal people kept fishing. The state said no, but this time we have guns. And this time we're bringing the federal government to help us. So there was these moratoriums on tribal fishers. And so we'd have it, but the Yurok people just never quit. They just wouldn't quit, right? That we're Indian people, this is our land, and we are gonna do, this is how we live, but you can't take that away from us. And ultimately they didn't. The tribe went to the case. A great uncle of the family's took a case where he got his gill net just taken from him. He had it in the river, state wardens took it. He went to court, like, well, give us $1, we'll give it back to you. He's like, no, and this is how he said, I'm a goddamn Indian, this is my right to fish on this river. And the state court's like, no, sorry, this reservation doesn't exist anymore because it was allotted so heavily. It went through 2 levels of state court. California Supreme Court agreed, said, nope, sorry, we agree with that. It was just too heavily allotted. Supreme Court, though, did not agree and said there was nothing that ever disestablished the reservation. This is still Indian country. Therefore, you are still an Indian, and you can fish and give him his gill net back for free. That changed everything. That led to the reinvigoration of the tribe's internal governing bodies. It set up for the first time in the early 80s an actual Yurok tribal government, and while still federally recognized, and it's terrible you're not, I'm really sorry. They didn't have a formal government. So in the early 80s, they actually formalized it with constitution, right? What do we believe as Yurok people? How do we want to manage what we have now, right? Which at the time wasn't enough. So they created this constitution. And one of the key directives in the constitution was to reclaim the tribal land base and enlarge it whenever you have that opportunity. Basically, do anything you can to get the land back. Restore, enhance, and manage the tribal fishery, the tribal water rights, tribal forests, and all other natural resources. Preserve and promote our culture, language, and religious beliefs and practices, and pass them on to our children, our grandchildren, and to their children and grandchildren on forever. Like any other tribe, I mean, obviously it was very different here. It's a pretty new and fresh constitution, right? I mean, my Navajo Nation, we don't have a constitution. We have just a Navajo Nation code. It's very Western. It's very codified. It's not fun to read, but it does have some beautiful things in there. But it's also doesn't, it was also done a long time ago. And I think there are things that we think about differently now, and things that we obviously have to think about differently now. But this set in place like these directives, right? I mean, if knowing who, I mean, you got a sense of who the Yurok people are and where they come from, right? So what have we done recently? If our goal is to protect and manage Yurok resources within the Yurok Aboriginal territory, not just that sliver of a reservation the tribe has, but the entire Aboriginal territory, which includes a lot of federal public lands, which includes private lands. We're going to recover the land base and manage that land based on traditional values. And to do that, we're going to seek opportunities to buy properties and cooperate with state and federal governments whenever we can. Sometimes that's worked, sometimes it hasn't. On the Klamath River, the key thing that the tribe is doing now is collaborating on the fishery. And this happens I think this probably happens, in case you would know more about how the fisheries management, how it happens over here on the Atlantic, but in the Pacific, the tribes and the tribal scientists are key partners in the Pacific Fishery Management Council, where you get your scientists and your technical experts to say, what's the status of the fishery every year? How are we gonna manage this? Tribes are at that table, right? That's been that way for a little bit. It's not new. The fish wars in Washington and on the Columbia were amazing. Dam removal, something I'll touch on just a little bit later. We're working, and we're in the final stretch of getting the lower 4 dams on the Klamath River removed. These dams that have caused, basically, you saw that bow tie at the beginning of the Yurok of the Klamath River Basin, cut it off in half. Fish could not get onto the upstream half of that. Then all the river restoration that goes along with that. The tribe is in collaborative management agreements with the Redwood National and State Parks. So you go to those parks, they have Yurok exhibits, like signage up there. They have places to go listen to how the tribal elders explained the forests and what was going on in certain areas, pronounce and discuss Yurok words there. Tribe recently got a co-management agreement with the Stone Lagoon Visitor Center. As you head south from the tribe and head towards Arcata and Eureka, there's these really cute, really cool and really beautiful big lagoons, freshwater lagoons. Massive, right? Just gorgeous. And the tribe, and they have a visitor center, and one of them, tribe is now basically managing that, which is pretty cool. And then this year, in the last few months, the tribe has released California condors back into the air around in that part of California. It's amazing. And on the reservation, we hold the pens and where basically reintroduction sites are going to be. The tribes are working on this for a long time. So now we have these massive birds, pregoniche, they call them, up in the air again. I think the one thing I really was interested in, really happy to share kind of in this Indigenous-led conservation conference was what we're doing and the tribe is doing with the forest, right? So again, the forest was lost to big timber. We had all these subsequent ecosystem problems because of that, let alone that there was a gate where the tribal people couldn't get into their forest anymore, right? And you had machines and big scary equipment running around all the time. So how did we had to find ways to get the land back. State programs, state grants, federal programs, other things, other ideas people could come up with. And through that, we reclaimed over 60,000 acres of land within the Yurok Reservation since 2011. That's awesome. But what do you do when you get the land back? Right? It's almost like it's great to have that. Now I have to take care of it too, which is also what you want. But how the heck do I do that? Right? I mean, it increased the amount of land that the tribe had to manage by how many fold? And how do you create budgets to handle that and staffing? And it's not like you're getting this beautiful piece of land back either. You're getting something that's just been slash piles and torn up sides of hills. So, of course, you develop a healthy forest, or not a healthy forest, a forest management plan based on what the tribe needs. In your vision, what's your vision of how that forest looks? Right? Healthy forest equals healthy fish and wildlife equals healthy Yurok people. And then the next phase, after you get that, is you institutionalize and support management of that. And that's hard, right? Because that costs a lot of money, right? There's always, sometimes it's easy to get money for the hot, shiny things like getting the land back. It's harder to get money for O&M, right? I mean, you guys know that. I mean, it's hard to do, but it's the work. And that's where the tribe is now, and a lot of this is doing that work, trying to figure out how to make that happen. And so, but the kind of this overriding principle too the tribe has in the forest management plan is one of the core tenets of our traditional ecological knowledge is that nature is not natural without human interaction, right? This isn't this perception that we have in the Wilderness Act where wilderness is untrammeled by man, right? I mean, the landscape is a landscape. Humans are a part of the ecosystem. At some point we took ourselves out, and that's caused various problems. So here's where we are. These are different phases of land acquisition. And here's the biggest ones we're talking about. Let's see, get this. We have this phase here, which we call the Yurok Community Forest. It's in orange. We have in blue what we call a salmon sanctuary. Sounds nice, huh? And then we have these other kind of different parcels, and these are just denoted by basically how we acquired them and when we acquired them. But here's the mouth of here's kind of the mouth of the river up in the upper left. You kind of move upriver, and you kind of get a couple of small tribal groups, like a tribal community there. Excuse me. But then we have now this almost untouched, like contiguous piece of land all the way here. That's amazing. This wasn't there. 15 years ago, all that land was not tribal land. Now it is. So the idea here is up through the Salmon Sanctuary is Blue Creek. Blue Creek is, at the top of it is what they call the high country. Again, this was the part of this Ling case that the tribe was involved in back in the 80s. And from where Blue Creek comes into the Klamath River is a critical place. It's critical ecologically because it provides cold water. So you have this cold water, basically refuge for fish that come up the river, and they're coming up the river in the summer when the river water gets hot. And it gets hot upriver. So you get in these kind of hot flows. You have this salmon migration upstream, and salmon just need a break, right? So they hang out in this cold water. They rest. They get charged up. You see them there. It's amazing to see them there. It's not quite like Alaska, cool, but it's cool. But if you follow the river up, there's different paths, traditional and historic paths that the tribe has taken from there for different ceremonial events. And then you get to the high country, and that's where you pray. That's where you get your medicine for ceremony. And so we bought as much of that land back as we could and are now protecting it and are trying to restore it to make sure that the tribes are safe in there and that the ecosystem is doing what it needs to support itself. Part of our next goal, just off the cuff, is how do we get co-management up here? It's not impossible. This is Six Rivers National Forest, right? Right now we have willing folks who are interested in talking. But like other beautiful, important places, there's a lot of the other tribes share this interest. So it's about maybe trying to build, a network and a support between other tribes to do so. But here on the Yurok Community Forest, this is going to be more of a place that's going to be this is basically a sanctuary type place, really restoration focused. Here is going to be a little bit more of a let's use this a little bit more. Let's put things in there we need to. Let's put camping in there better. If we need to do some logging, the tribe's going to have to log for a while because we need 3 age stands of trees to become a healthy forest again. Right now we have 1. When all you're doing is clear cutting, everything's gonna be the same age, and that's not sustainable. So it's just a couple different models about how we work in those parts of the forest. What that means for Yurok tribal members is really quite profound. Vice Chairman Myers, Frankie Myers, this is a quote that he had made. When I was a young man growing up on the reservation, all of our land lay behind locked gates. We'd have to break into our land in order to get into our prayer sites. In order to get to our gathering sites, we had to be outlaws. And here we are today. My kids growing up will never have that feeling. My wife can gather without worrying about being harassed by law enforcement or a logging company. The most beneficial thing we're doing with our land is giving members access to it. That is the greatest benefit we've done with our land. Never did he say it was someone else's land. He said, we're just getting our land back. And that's what it is, right? That's what it is for y'all too. A handful of years ago, they hosted an international delegation of folks interested in talking about climate issues into the forest. This is kind of what the forest looks like in the lower part, kind of towards the coast. But you can see how dense it is. You get these massive ferns, you get these trees those are small trees. They're big trees though. We've got a few more minutes. I just want to talk about the dam removal effort. So this is fishing season. This is my wife fishing. This was a good year because there was fish. And she was originally scheduled to be here. The tribe is in town in DC where we are, and they've been on the Hill and hearings the last few days. So she's sorry she couldn't be here. But this is her work, right? Because she's Yurok, and so this is her work. but I get to share in it. Undam the Klamath. This has been something that's been going on for a long time. So Pacificor, not the federal government, owns 4 dams on the lower Klamath River. I'll go to that real quick. So you see Iron Gate, Copco 1, Copco 2, J.C. Boyle. In the course of developing, quote, reclaiming the Klamath River, at the headwaters, when the Bureau of Reclamation was set up in the early 1900s, they decided to drain a massive lake/wetlands, put hundreds of miles of canals in there, and create farming where there was no farming. Again, high desert, all the problems associated with that. I mean, the Klamath River, as maybe you all are aware, is one of the major river systems out west just experiencing crushing drought. And it's been years we've had very low flows, very low precipitation, high heat, and with that it becomes like the Colorado River. It becomes, how do you manage what water you have? When the people are suffering because there's not enough water, and the land is suffering, and the species in the river are suffering, how do you manage those? So we've been in legal fights, basically the same legal fight for over 20 years, trying to figure that stuff out. So that'll continue. We're still doing that. We're drafting papers now, still. But these 4 dams were a part of this hydropower project that Pacificor had owned. It provides a very minimal amount of hydropower, really, to the region. And when it came up, it was time to basically look to relicense these dams. And for years, of course, the tribes were incensed that these dams were even there. They were never consulted or asked. And of course, that didn't happen in the 30s and 40s, right? We were trying to terminate tribes. That's mostly what we cared about at that moment. So we have these crazy dams that don't allow the fish and have hurt runs. You lose access to spawning ground, and FERC and the state said, okay, Pacificor, if you want to relicense these dams, here's basically the price tag, because we got to accommodate the fish. These fish are now ESA listed, and they're on a fast downhill trajectory. The price tag was insane. But they always are, I think, for these projects anyway. But we had so much pressure from the tribes, especially Yurok, right? That it ended up, it didn't work on the books, but it also didn't work from a social justice perspective either, social or ecological justice perspective. So the tribe has worked so hard, and they've been able to find agreements and basically force the issue working with Pacificor, right? You're adversaries, but you're still working kind of towards the same goal, right? And that's the way these things feel. They're not like arm in arm things. But you're working towards basically the same goal, and you just have different paths to get there. And so this is where we are. It's really exciting. I think it's next year, maybe the winter of 2024, these dams are starting to be decommissioned and actually removed. Be the biggest river restoration project. It'll be the biggest river restoration project in history. And we've seen it work, right? We've seen it work in Washington, and it's going to work here. It's going to be fantastic. So this has been just fantastic for the tribe, and it's just been one of the number of things that tribes have been participating on, and it's really been fascinating and just awesome to work along and support the tribe in these efforts. So thanks.
Thank you, Daniel, for your incredible presentation. I really do want to dive a little bit deeper into that point you made about reconnecting ecosystems and biodiversity hotspots, kind of like glue, and the different types of glue we can use to do so. Before we go on to our roundtable discussion and audience Q&A, which I think I'll merge together because I do want to keep my promise to get y'all to lunch, I would like to take a moment, though, and ask our audience to please join me in thanking our panelists here for their incredible knowledge and thought that they gave us. That being said, on the fly, I would hope to try and merge both the roundtable discussion questions that we actually developed together as prepping for this panel with some of the questions that we were going to receive from the audience. So if you're able right now, audience members, please write down those questions on those 3x5 index cards. Our virtual audience, please submit your questions to the Zoom chat. And, oh, we already have a pile. All right, then. And I'm actually going to come down and sit next to you. And the microphones next to all of us will be working. Hello. Ooh, hello. That's the same thing about when I grew about 6 inches just then. My voice grew. Maybe I'll go back and forth between our roundtable discussion questions and these questions we received here. Oh, thank you. All right. You think so? One of these? Thank you. Okay. So one of the first question that we had developed together is, I hope to launch this discussion with a personal and professional hybrid approach, in that the question is, can you speak about an aha moment or a light bulb moment you experienced that was pivotal to your work on Indigenous conservation, and how this moment has stayed with you and informed your work since? Casey, would you like to go first?
Sure, thank you. So there's been a number of aha moments in my life and in this work, but having the privilege to have this question in advance, I got to pick one. But one of the aha moments I've had is working closely with my colleague and friend, Dr. Kelsey Leonard, when we talk about adaptation and resilience and really what to do about sea level rise and going into the future. Dr. Leonard points out that a lot of adaptation outside of tribal spaces is kind of aggressive, and looking in for an example of that is like building seawalls, or in some examples there's an approach called attack, and that's where you get landfill or whatever, and you start like trying to build land out into the ocean, and that these approaches really being kind of very contrary to many indigenous place approaches of working with what is going on at the time. And so, of course, with the attack approach, it's like, I'll show you, ocean, and that often doesn't end well. And so one of the things, the aha moment was, using approaches that are kind of blending with what's happening, and using kind of natural-based approaches, whether they're like sand dunes are protection anyways. It's important to have those around, so protect and care for those as opposed to a straight-up seawall. Last thing I'll leave on this question is another aha related to that is when Dr. Leonard and I were discussing really the painful things that are going on around us, especially where communities are facing, such as Chief Chasen in your community, where the flooding, the water's just coming in and people are leaving. One of the things that Dr. Leonard and I discussed, and she left me with, was like, in those events that, worst case scenario where tribal communities have to move to a different area, that does not relinquish our tribal relationship to that area. So we, for example, like, we will talk about our lands, but we will also talk about our seascapes. So even if a place is ocean, if that's where our ancestors are, it's still our spot. So always remembering that. And so I think that's why they say kind of like territorial expansion, in that. And so I'll pass it along. Thank you.
There really wasn't an aha moment in my tribe. I've been watching the land disappear from my backyard all my life. Where I mentioned it earlier, where I used to hunt, 21 years ago, we hunt deer in my backyard, and we're really fishing in my backyard. And then, you know, one of the things is that we see our alligators adapting to salt water. We have the largest population of alligators in the United States, and now you see them in salt water, which is something you never seen before. Where my dad's from was Gorton, and now you have pure salt water. You fish in Gulf fish in right there to Landon. And then so where I live at, we have the fastest erosion in the world. We lose a football field every 100 minutes. So there's never been an aha moment for my tribe because we see it every day. Thank you.
I don't, kind of like Chief Lauren, I don't know if I have exactly a moment, but here I did have an experience though, which is the same. The moment in my history is a part of my geologic time. Kind of when I knew Casey, when we were working, I was a master's student studying hydrology at the University of Colorado. Really just interested in how much backcountry skiing and hiking I could get in a year. So my research was focused around that, basically like mountain systems and biochemistry and things like that. Just super cool. But it was kind of like my slant on it was not a tribal slant at all. I wasn't in this world. When my grandmother passed away, my Navajo grandmother, she never spoke English, but I'd spent time with her on the reservation, in extended blocks, and during the ceremonies, kind of after her passing, there was just something just profound that happened in there, where I really identified with, sometimes I feel bad even saying it, but it was the first time I really identified and felt like the pull, right? Of like this is what I need to protect, right? This is where I can. This is what means most to me. And it was just something very, very strong there that I don't not think about it often.
Those are perfect answers. Thank you to everyone. I don't mean to belittle moments, but experience. They're absolutely synonymous. The ones that are profound and stay with you consciously and subconsciously throughout your work. Now, switching to a question from our audiences. I'm trying to group by theme, and actually there seems to be a strong interest in what are some suggestions on engaging tribal youth in environmental conservation programs and larger like community building in the face of these dense topics, scary topics in these times. I will start with Daniel this time, if that's okay.
No, it's good. I mean, this goes back to an unanswered question, as always, of me in that dugout canoe from the beginning. One of the things the tribe, and it's been fast, it's incredible, like a lot of you experienced this over the last 10 years, really, maybe 15, but the revitalization of language, which is, of course, culture, and what comes along with that. And so these dugout canoes on the Yurok Reservation, I mean, everyone's super into it right now. And they're building new canoes, they're getting them on the water. And with that, there's time to interact kind of the way that tribal people interact, right? I mean, that's what fishing does. It gives you time to be with your family and learning these lessons, and you connect dots that way. And so we whether that's something maybe more formal as like summer youth programs, or something that's dedicated to, okay, we're going to talk about baskets or talk about the canoes. I mean, I've seen that, and I've seen an engagement of tribal kids on at least out Yurok, like in ways that wasn't there before.
I agree with that. When I seen this picture with the dugout, I was very excited to see that because our people, did dugouts, and so we still have a few around. But one of the things that I would like to, that was my platform one of the platforms that I ran on was the youth, getting the cultural aspect of it. And a long time ago, when I first started, many moons ago, we did a program, it was a youth program, and what we did, it was 5 tribes in Louisiana that we worked together every summer with the ages 16 to 21. And what we did, each tribe had to do a presentation to each other, to the audience, and then we wanted them to learn tribal lessons, tribal issues, becoming tribal councils, tribal chiefs. So what we would actually have people run, and people would nominate who's going to be representing their tribe, and then we would give them scenarios. After they voted in, we would give them scenarios, figure it out, and then we would have tribal leaders that come in and to assist them. And that was a great program. And because of the funding from our government was slashed, that program was slashed, and I thought that was one of the best programs that we had within the Department of Labor. And so that's a program that I would like to bring back in our tribe, and also to be able to fishing. I want people to, it's important that we learn our traditional ways, and most of our young people have been fishing. They're fishing people. I fish. I'm going Saturday fishing, and so but the shrimping as well. And you was mentioning oysters. That's something that after this hurricane has really devastated our people because of the mud that the hurricane brought in. So a lot of our people is not harvesting oysters right now because they're all dead. And so we have a tribal young man, his name is Jason Petrie, and he started a program in the Grand Isle area where it's the raised bed oysters. And I had never heard of that until just recently, and I thought that's fascinating. And so that's something that I would like to start teaching our young people how to do that, because that's going to be the future, because the hurricanes is going to continue coming. And so, that's many programs I want to do with our youth. But thank you.
Thank you. Some really wonderful examples. When we think of youth and youth engagement, I'm very passionate about that. From time teaching at Thon Community College, but also coming home with, in our tribe we have the Natural Resources Department continues to run a program called Preserving Our Homelands, or POH is the acronym. And when I was there, we also did that program. We were kind of directing it towards middle school youth, and we kept it open to youth that are tribal citizens, but we also said youth in tribal households. So because we do have multicultural families in our communities, and want to be very open in exposure to the culture. And as I was saying before, we took the approach that we're scientists already, but drawing from our traditional knowledge, and this youth program POH continues to this day, and it's just balanced by we do have scientists that come from, say, the U.S. Geological Survey or National Oceanic Administration, or NOAA, or science, these institutions as guest instructors. But we're always making sure and balancing that with native scientists that we have in our own communities that are taking our kids out to fish and what to look for, and out in the woods and understanding how these things are working. We've used terms like culture keepers and things like that, just so that our youth know that science can come from different areas and perspectives. I think the great challenge that we have is getting the youth engagement and cultural teachings and native science into the K through 12 curriculum, because our youth go to public school in Mashpee anyways. So from morning to the afternoon, they're getting the public school curriculum and science in that fashion. Then we get them after school and maybe in the summertime. So it's kind of like an extracurricular thing. So I'd like to see the needle move from it being extracurricular to the core. And that's a lot of work because that's really engaging and kind of countering a lot of standardized K through 12 education that our youth are going through. So I think youth engagement is such a profound investment. And last thing I'll say about it is also working amongst departments. Sometimes we siloed a little bit with our POH camp, but we started to get out of that because we said, we need to talk to the language camp, and we need to which was the turtle camp, and make sure that the kids were coordinating on the curriculum and getting out of our silos. So I just wanted to offer those examples. Thank you.
The essence of time, I hope to get one last question in, and I'm going to try and hybrid actually the numbers 3 and 5 that we had discussed with a question I have in front of me. How can we, as the federal government, work with tribal public safety, emergency management, homeland security, and environmental and natural resources personnel to manage and protect tribal infrastructure while honoring and protecting cultural resources, best serving tribal communities? And I guess I turned to 3 and 5, and for all y'all to know, one of the questions we had talked about was what was equitable co-management, co-collaboration, co-creation look like, and how's it formed? And then number 5 on our end is talking about what are some of the critical infrastructure and enabling conditions that allow those conservation successes, like co-management, come to reality. That was a lot to throw at you guys. Would you like me to read the index card again if that is our focus, or do you feel prepared, Daniel, if I ask you to go first?
Yeah, I'll say something.
There's the index card too.
I'm going to take it away from the federal government. Hello. I'm going to remove it a little bit from the federal government response angle, but just talk about maybe what success could look like. One thing I was able to work with and represent my tribe, Navajo, on the Bears Ears initiative and the Bears Ears Coalition. While not perfect, it was an opportunity for the tribes to come together and provide direct management recommendations to federal agencies at a high level and a regular level, and through that, I mean, you could see, what you need, and the best things I can tell are when you have high level, you have somebody in the secretary's office, whatever secretary that is, that's responding to the tribes. Then you have people in the regional offices and the area offices that have relationships with the tribes too, because that's the day-to-day stuff, right? That's the work. And so I think those are really hard. I mean, co-management's really tricky because, especially if you're talking about federal resources, because the federal government ultimately has to make the decision for that. So it can't be 50-50. A tribe can't, legally they're not supposed to get a veto power, but you can give the tribe a lot of power, right? If the government chooses to. And that's what we learned with sacred sites law too. It's a lot of it's up to federal discretion. So if you can get an upwelling of support and commitment and responsibility shared for different tasks on certain issues, I think that's a good model, at least to start with.
Well, my answer will not be like these guys, because the United Homa Nation is not allowed to co-manage our natural resources because the government has not given us that right. Since we are not a federally recognized tribe, we are not able to deal with the government on a government-to-government relationship. So I can't, that's my answer for this question.
When I thought about this question a little bit and co-management, I'll talk about, let's talk turkey, as they say, the funding. I do subscribe to the saying that show me your budget and your line items, and I'll show you where your values are. And I have seen projects that part of my work working with the CASC is also reviewing proposals, and some of these proposals talk about co-management. I've seen, for example, some proposals that say, okay, this is going to be a joint project bringing Western science and traditional knowledge together to address a problem. But then I looked at the budget, and 95% of the budget supported the Western science staff and job security and benefits and all that, and then 5% was one-time stipends to those who shared traditional knowledge that they're going to have to probably report on their taxes now, or they don't have to. I mean, it's up to them. But you don't do what you want, but it was profoundly unequitable, and it showed that one scientific approach was monetarily much more valued than another. So I think, again, looking at whether it's projects or funding to support, tribal-based projects, the budget's going to speak for itself. And then I would add to that, respecting the sovereignty of tribal nations and agencies to do what is needed with that budget. We have a lot of situations of digging in and say, this funding's for you, but you have to do it this way. Or you need to do this, this, and this. And so I always kind of, when I look at grants, I'm like, you got to allow food in these grants, because Native people, we get together and we eat, we make decisions. So gotta have food as an allowable expense in that. So I think a lot needs to be considered with the budget and how it's used in those kind of items.
Casey's response makes me think of one quick thing. We're going to keep Zoe's promise here. There's with all this new funding that's come on, right, with the IIJA and now the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a lot of money for a lot of climate resilience type projects. But how do tribes take advantage of that? I think that's a question, and I think talking about now that there's money and there's maybe budget line items there, how the heck do we access it, and how do we make it work for tribes? So I think maybe trying to be able to work with agencies, maybe suggesting and here's what we need, here's what we don't need out of these application processes, because we have folks who, I work in the Colorado River Basin quite a bit on water issues, and people lose staff like a week or two to working on grants, right? And that's just the front end. And it's longer sometimes. Then compliance is really hard, so you lose your project sometimes just through that. So how do we help the government, and how do we make those things flexible so tribes can take advantage of it, so Casey can eat more at his meetings, things, for example?
Like I said, I did want to keep my promise. I'm sorry we have to cut this section of our session short. To quickly follow up, biggest thank yous to our panelists for the time and care that you guys have given presentations, me, our audience here today. Biggest thank you to our audience for staying engaged for a lengthy session. And of course, biggest thanks to Chief and Pat, who invited me to be here today and speak to you all. I hope we all have a great lunch. Thank you.